Joining me now is the UFC creator and co-founder. He will be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, the contributor wing of the UFC Hall of Fame this July at International Fight Week. It is long overdue, but I suppose better late than never. It is the one, the only Art Davie back on the program. Art, thank you so much for taking the time. How are you?
Well, Nick, it's a pleasure to be here. We haven't talked in a few years, but we have an interesting and a wonderful history to go back on. And, of course, this week for me has been really great. The UFC obviously is making a commitment to acknowledge, not just to those old school fans, but to all of their fans, that this is a franchise and a sport with a history. So for me to be able to be recognized as being the creator and co-founder is pretty special this week. I'm having a great time.
Before we even dive into you finding out you'd be inducted and everything that goes with that, just on your point of the UFC finally kind of addressing their history, do you think, have they done a good job of that over the years, or have they sort of not really told their fans enough, in your opinion?
Well, I have understood from the beginning, since Zuffa, acquired the UFC in 2001, that they had a pretty hard job at that point. Remember that we had been virtually shut out of pay-per-view, and that was our number one revenue stream. So I think in the beginning, in order to be able to get the sanctioning bodies to authorize this sport, and I think it was brilliant on their part to be able to hire Mark Ratner, who was the former executive director of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, and probably one of the most respected figures in that universe, bring him on board as the vice president of government affairs, because he was able then to open up a lot of doors and getting this thing sanctioned in states that up to that point considered it a banded event. So I think when you look at the history of what Zuffa had to deal with, I think one of the things that they did, and I don't think they did it with any negative intent, I think was to basically kind of move on from where it had been and basically present what they were doing as a sanctionable sport. Now, I don't mind pointing out to a lot of the fans that by UFC 15, we had added virtually 85-90% of the rules that were adopted by the Unified Rules of MMA in the state of New Jersey in 2001, and later on Nevada, and 2005 California, 2016 New York State. So we had moved ourselves back in the old school days when it was WOW Promotions and Semaphore to making the changes to what we were presenting. So we started to add things like gloves, rules, rounds, time limits, weight classes, restricted techniques, blows, and holds. So we were moving in a direction. But when Zuffa came in, they were faced with the problem of how to present this again to the media, to the public, to politicians, in a way that would get them some acceptance that had been denied us. So I think in a way, it wasn't as if they distanced themselves from the past, but they had to focus and concentrate on presenting what they were doing at that point in a very new and clear way. I would have done the same thing.
Well, and especially in a sport that, hey, it didn't really reach its peak until, say, like the Tough era, when Tough 1 came in, and then they, Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonner put on the great fights, and then 2007, you had like the Tito Ortiz era, the Chuck Liddells, Randy Couture's. It didn't take off, and so even though Zuffa purchased it, back in 2001 or so, I agree that although looking back on history for anything, not just in sports or anything else, just in life is kind of important. That's why, hey, grade 11, I had to take history because there is some importance, there is some value there. But ultimately, I think in such a niche sport, you have to focus on the future and making sure you're going to make it out alive and grow. And so I agree. Okay, let's talk about you being in the Hall of Fame. When did you actually find out that you would be inducted this year?
Got a call about 2 weeks ago from Sean, and he said, I got a friend of yours on the phone. And I figured it might have been a fighter he ran into, somebody like, maybe Steve Jenham. Sean had been in Omaha in and around the Christmas Hanukkah season, and had run into Steve. And so he gets me I'm on the phone, and all of a sudden he puts on Ant Evans, who's in charge of the Hall of Fame and Fight Pass over at the UFC. And I've known Ant for a couple of years. We've met a couple of times. I really met him, I guess, back around 2013 when I came out to Nevada again to write the book, Is This Legal? So Ant tells me on the phone, he said, I got great news. He said, you're being inducted to the Contributors Wing of the Hall of Fame on July 5th. I don't know who was more excited. I don't know if it was Sean Wheelock or Ant Evans who were more excited, because they kept asking me, how do you feel about this? I said, well, it's pretty good. But they were jumping up and down. I could tell they were bouncing off the floor. And, Ant has felt that it's important to be able to go back and acknowledge history. And Ant said something very interesting to me. He said, everything I'm doing from this point on, quite frankly, is for those fans 60, 70, 80 years from today when all of us are gone. And I want them to look at the Hall of Fame and see a steady progression of historical development with individuals who made important contributions in and out of the octagon and to the sport. So he said, for me, it was a logical move to be able to bring up the issue about, isn't it time now to bring Art Davie into the Hall of Fame? I've been thrilled. They've done a great job of treating me wonderful in the last couple of weeks. I can tell that they're real excited about this, and it shows. When I went down to the headquarters about a week and a half ago and spent a whole day there, I got a chance to meet a lot of the employees, some of them doing what used to be my job, and kind of comparing notes with them and listening to what they've got to deal with now. I remember talking to a young fellow who's in charge of matchmaking there, and he and I were comparing notes of what I used to have to deal with in the old days. And
would that be Mick Maynard?
Yes.
Okay.
And what is to deal with now, in terms of fighters cutting weight, 20 pounds for a bout, the multiple weight classes, training. I was fascinated and impressed by the UFC's Performance Institute, because I sat down and had lunch this week with Forrest Griffin. He stopped over at the table, and we were chatting a bit and what he does there. And, Forrest and I were agreeing that back in the day, if a fighter went and worked with an NFL strength coach, as Ken Shamrock did for Ultimate 96, he hooked up with the strength coach from the Cincinnati Bengals. So back in the day, some of the fighters thought, all I got to do is to pump the enormous machine of weights the way the football linemen do, or the running. No, it's become an involved sport. And Forrest was explaining to me today in terms of flexibility, cardio, fast twitch, fiber development, slow twitch. I mean, today they're creating the template for what is necessary to be a competitive athlete in a sport that has evolved over the last 25 years.
And just to add on to that, I feel like, I'm biased because MMA is my favorite sport, but I feel like MMA fighters might just be the best athletes on the planet. If you take into consideration cardio and things like that, and the fact that they need to know everything, they need to be able to grapple and strike. Let's be honest. Sometimes we see basketball players or hockey players, they seem to be going hard, but we forget they're on for 2 minutes, and then they get a break, and then they're on for another 2 minutes. MMA fighters, 5-minute rounds, maybe 25 minutes if you're a champion. MMA is a crazy sport in that regard.
Yeah, Nick, I agree with what you just said, because today when you look at the well-rounded training regimen that is necessary for a top-line MMA fighter, you've got an athlete that has got a broad cross-section of what it takes to be physically an athlete. Whatever his natural talent was, now in terms of flexibility, in terms of explosive power as opposed to strength, cardio, the ability to handle nervous exhaustion. Today's MMA athlete probably could be compared not only favorably, but maybe in a superior fashion to athletes from any other sport today in the world. Certainly, there's nobody out there that you could say categorically is light years beyond what the MMA fighter has to do. Today, to be a top MMA athlete, you can see that these guys now, it's not a part-time job. This is what they need to do in order to be able to be competitive. They got to be in it full time.
So you get on the phone with Sean Shelby and then Ant Evans. You talked a little bit about your reaction already, but sort of just expand. It sounds like you were very excited, because I think this is long overdue. Yeah,
when Wheelock and Evans got on the phone, I'll be honest with you, it was kind of a surprise. I didn't quite anticipate it. I thought maybe it would be next year. But it was certainly a thrill because this is the 25th anniversary. And interestingly enough, the announcement that was made by the UFC yesterday, coincidentally, was made 25 years to the day after I had received a fax from Semaphore Entertainment Group in New York, basically a letter of intent expressing their interest to move forward with WOW Promotions in a joint development deal to create what became the UFC. 25 years to the day. And I think Ed had timed that because I had supplied him with a lot of documents that they had requested, a lot of materials for an exhibit that they're creating that will be displayed during Fight Week in Vegas and then is going out on the road to 9 cities before coming back to Vegas 3 times. And there'll be a lot of photos in there and illustrations, some of the original designs for the Octagon, and a lot of the documentation for the deals. You know, I've actually got a copy of the agreement for McNichols Arena for UFC 1, an NBA stadium that I had rented for a $4,000 fee to put UFC 1. So Ant Evans had all of this information, including all of the documents between WOW and Semaphore. So he's eager to display those and let the old school and new school fans see what that's all about. And I think now they're even building a case to be able to house some of the larger items, like my original jacket for commission as the Ultimate Fighting Alliance commissioner that I wore. So I'm real excited about the fact that I think they've made a real strong commitment to honor the past, give me a pat on the back. And of course, in all fairness, the greatest thing in the world is that however many fans know my contribution, that number is going to be increased considerably now that I'm in the Hall of Fame. I've been inundated in the last 2 days with requests for interviews, phone calls, texts, Facebook messages. It seems like everybody in the world has woken up and said, hey, who's this Art Davie guy? And let me talk to him. It sounds interesting. So I'm really indebted to the UFC because the success that we've had, Sean and I, with the book, Is This Legal?, I think can only increase in time as people discover the early history. You know, in a sense, I guess you could compare me in a way to an Abner Doubleday in baseball or a Dr. James Naismith in basketball. And I'm always flattered if anybody makes those connections because I did have the crazy idea and I was a Pied Piper and I had to blow my little pipe and get everybody to follow me. And I was lucky in that I was able to get martial artists, investors, TV people, and fans. That's who really created the UFC, by the way, Nick. It was the fans. Because not only did they embrace it from the very beginning, but during the dark years, from 1998 to 2002, it was the fans who kept it alive.
You mentioned that yesterday, April 27th, 2018, was exactly 25 years from when you received a fax letter of intent from Campbell McLaurin, of course. When did you realize that that was the case and it was kind of a special day for the UFC to announce it? Because that's when they announced your induction. Did you realize that? Had you known that? Or did you read an article and realize that? Or? No,
all of those documents they're either in the book or they're associated with the website, isThisLegal.thebook.com, about the book. So, you know, that's a fact that I've known for a long time. In fact, interestingly enough, I've got a text on my phone from February 10th from Campbell McLaurin. And Campbell says something very interesting to me on that day. He says, on February, he says to me, and I'll have to read this to you. I think it's kind of interesting. He says, on February 10th, Art, I'm thinking of celebrating 25 years since Art called Campbell Day. So he was acknowledging that 2 months was coming up, 2 months was arriving, that we was able to say this was the day that we had first hooked up. You know, this was actually the day. So that was the day, in a sense, that I got Semaphore involved in this. They were thinking about midget wrestling, and I said, midgets, little midgets, and they were doing one shots. They were doing comedy and they were doing concerts. But you know, how many times a year could you bring Andrew Dice Clay on pay-per-view? Once, maybe twice in a year, just once. And the same thing with music acts, you know? So they were looking for a franchise. I walk in the door, And I've got the franchise because I'm telling them from the very beginning. I'm telling them from the very beginning that this is going to be something we will do. We'll do 6, 8, 9 times a year. We'll just keep crowning somebody as the Ultimate Fighting Champion, the Lord of the Ring, the Apex Predator, the Great White Shark. And if the guy repeats or three-peats, great. And if he doesn't, suddenly there's a new Lord of the Ring. So, I mean, it was an idea that as soon as you grasped it, really, and Semaphore did, remember that HBO didn't. I love to tell fans, was it hard in the beginning? I got turned down by fighters a lot, but the TV people made it really hard. Because I remember I knew I couldn't get it on broadcast. I wasn't going to go on one of the 3 or 4 big channels back in the day. And I knew probably cable wasn't ready for this. So where was it going to go? Pay-per-view. And I'm the guy with the idea that says I can monetize the martial arts. Remember that the martial arts, if you were any good at it back in the day, you probably got out of it. Look at Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Steven Seagal. If you were any good at the martial arts, you went in the TV or the movies. And if you were a local guy running a school, you were making the living, Nick, but you weren't getting rich. And you didn't challenge the guy across town. Why? If you did a public bout with him to demonstrate your art against his martial art and you lost, it meant you were going to lose customers. So nobody has figured a way to make money with the martial arts. That was my brilliant idea. I said, I've got the way to monetize it. If it belongs on pay-per-view, my idea was a tournament, because in one night, single elimination tournament, you'd have to win 3 bouts to be crowned the Ultimate Fighter, the Lord of the Ring. So, I mean, it didn't take long for somebody to finally say, you know something? This is a great idea. And by the way, it was a great idea back in the past. For over 1,000 years, it was the most popular sport in the ancient Greek Olympics until the Roman Emperor in 394 AD banned it. It was too violent. And, of course, that too violent claim, the uber violent claim, came back years later when Senator McCain said, it's human cockfighting. And the New York Times called it the most barbaric show on earth. So there's nothing new under the sun. If I was stubborn and persistent, it's because I knew I was bringing back something that had worked for over 1,000 years. All I was doing was recreating the glory of classic Greece and classic Rome.
It's funny how, as we're doing this, you mentioned Greece. I'm wearing my Greece shirt. Just, quite the coincidence. Yeah, I went to Greece last month. Rome and Greece, actually. Italy and Greece. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Okay, so they could have inducted you into the Hall of Fame 5 years ago. They could have made it a big deal during their 20th anniversary of the UFC. They could have done it when they first launched the Hall of Fame years ago. They could have done it last year. They didn't have to wait until now. Why did it take this long?
Well, I heard that I was too short. There's a minimum height. I think it's 5'8" or 5'9", and I didn't qualify. So, all during that time, I was trying to figure a way to maybe put lips in my shoes. I knew I needed to be taller. You have to remember also that 3 out of the 5 Hall of Fame contributors have passed away. So there was a while there that maybe I was thinking, gee, maybe I would have considered suicide. That would ensure they would put me in. No, Nick, it was just a question of time and timing. So much of things in life are about timing. And quite frankly, to be in the 25th year is better to be in than the 22nd or the 23rd year. The 25th
More memorable. Do you think that's why they waited? Do you think, okay, Art Davie is such an important figure for this sport, for MMA, now that we're in year 23, let's just wait 2 more. Let's make it a bigger deal, because 25 years in the UFC, they've been pushing that logo, the slogan, UFC 25 years, this whole year, and they're definitely going to amp that up as October rolls around and November. Do you think that's why they ultimately waited?
Well, Nick, I can't answer that question. I'm going to have to wait till you interview Dana White or Ari Emanuel on your show and ask them, is there any reason why you waited till the 25th year? As I said earlier, I think that a lot of things had to evolve and change. Back in the day, we had gotten New York approved, and there we were, UFC 12. We were going to do a show in Niagara Falls. Senator Roy Goodman had written a law, and we got this sanctionable in the state of New York. And then a rival promotion announced they were going to do an event in New York City, and Mayor Rudy Giuliani said, no, 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 you're not going to come to New York City. I don't care what those guys up in the state capital of Albany said. And before you know it, the New York Times said, we think this is a bad idea. So, we thought at the time we spent money with the lobbyists to be able to get it sanctioned in New York. But you know something? It took till 2016 for New York finally to bless this. So, there's a time for everything. And I think as I've gotten older, I've realized, I think if you're a 25-year-old guy, if you're a 55-year-old man, there's a big difference. When you get to be my age, and I just turned 71 here in April, I think you have a bigger picture, and you look at the long march of history, yours and life, and you kind of see where it all fits in. But when I was young, I didn't do that because I was too eager. I was too eager to get the job done, But when you get a little older, you kind of realize that some of these things have their own pace, and that's the way things work.
A lot of people have been pushing for your induction to the Hall of Fame. I think one, your good friend Sean Wheelick, of course, former play-by-play man for Bellator. He does some great work at other promotions now, some on Fight Pass. I think you, being a humble person, haven't gone out publicly saying, I demand to be in the Hall of Fame. You haven't been pushing it yourself publicly, but I know others have for you. Did you ever get to a point where you just figured maybe they're just not going to do it for whatever reason? As crazy as that would be, did you ever reach a point where no?
No. I figured that there was an inevitability to the time when they would.
Okay.
2 years ago, John McCarthy kind of led the charge with Art, hashtag Art UFC HOF. And, a number of fans were supportive of that. And I didn't get too involved figuring that, ultimately it's a decision that the UFC has to make. It's their decision, not mine. And not even the fans, ultimately. Ultimately, the sport and the UFC being so central to the sport are really the pivot point for where MMA goes. Look, if MMA has gotten to the point where it's at, it's been due in large part to the UFC. Think about all the promotions that have come and gone. The IFL, the Bulldogs of this world, the Prides, the WECs, the Battlecades, the Mars, reality fighting. All of these have come and gone. The UFC is still there in the trenches as the premier brand. So I have a great respect, for that position. In advertising, we used to talk about positioning. The position that Coca-Cola has in the soda pop world is pretty much unassailable. The only one that can get close to them is Pepsi. And if you come along with a Joe Cola, you're a niche. And you're going to wind up selling a few bottles in a few places to a few customers. But you have to respect Coca-Cola's position. That's where the UFC is at. Now, today we see, that franchises like M1 in Russia and ONE FC in China, are cultivating markets that the UFC would like to do more in themselves. So it truly has become more of an international sport. But you cannot ignore the strength and the position of the premier brand. And that is the UFC.
Yep, it really is. You mentioned that being the Hall of Fame, it will lead to more people reading the book, or lead to just other things like that, and that's why it ultimately does matter. What does being in the Hall of Fame mean to you? Because I know I saw a comment from, I don't remember who it was, but just recently I saw someone say, the UFC Hall of Fame means nothing, blah, blah, blah. I think this was actually last weekend when Matt Serra was inducted. I feel like some people were saying, oh, he doesn't necessarily deserve it, and so that's sort of what led to that comment, but I do feel like the Hall of Fame, being in the UFC Hall of Fame, does matter. There is its importance. Do you agree? What exactly does being inducted mean to you?
Well, I'm an old ad man, an old salesman in an advertising agency. So my focus and my intent in trying to understand the popularity or the success of something is directly related to how the fans or the customers or the clients relate to the product. Look, since I've been announced that I'm going to be in the Hall of Fame, the response that I've gotten tells me that the Hall of Fame must be a very big deal. I've been inundated by people that some case I just don't know at all, from countries that I've never visited. as well as some fans I haven't talked to even in a few years who have reached back and said, Art, wow, the Hall of Fame. So I think that in and of itself is viable proof of how valuable the UFC. I think of all things I've done in the last 5 or 10 years, I think that this Hall of Fame, quite frankly, has had maybe the greatest impact of all. So there's my answer to your question. Is the UFC Hall of Fame important? I'm telling you now, as somebody who's on the receiving end and is being inducted, it's pretty overwhelming. It's like, boom, pay attention. You just got inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I'm like, whoa, all right. It's a good thing.
Did you expect this? Did you expect this overwhelming feedback?
You know, I that's a good question because since it's happened, I'm fairly shocked. I sat down last night and tried to catch a little free time smoking a cigar outside here on the patio, looking at the mountains and the sunset, and my phone was still ringing, and my phone was going off with new emails and posts being made all the time. And I kept looking at my phone and thinking, my God, it's like this thing is alive. It's jumping out of my hand. And what's going on? People are trying to tell me how important this is to them. And that, in fact, Nick, that was the really interesting thing. Almost everybody said almost the same thing to me. This has made an impact in my life, the UFC and the sport. I'm pleased to be able to acknowledge you for your role in making that happen. But what they're saying is, my life has changed. These are people who are now earning a living as journalists, making clothing that are lifestyle related to the UFC and the sport, fighters, managers, journalists, fans, guys who are running blogs. I did a radio interview this morning with a radio station in Phoenix, and the host was saying to me, he said, the first sport I really got interested in and became a super fan of, he said, was the UFC. And he was telling me which events he watched the first time. So that to me is really what has been a great reward for me, to hear from the fans saying what it means to them. Sean talks about it, Wheelock, in the book. He talks about the fact that he was, just a kid living at home and his mother paid the $14.95 for the UFC. He thought it was going to be a wrestling show, a work, and it turns out that it's this thing that, my God, what are these people doing? And then he's hooked. And look what it's done, as he said, for him. My whole life has been based around now this whole thing called MMA. He said, I occasionally do boxing and soccer. He said, but my real living is earned in the sport that I love, MMA. I'm fascinated to meet people now who are telling me how much this means to them. That means a lot to me.
The thing is, there are millions of MMA and particularly UFC fans around the world, and they have to think, they all have to, it all sort of comes around to you, and they should thank you, whether or not they know you. I mean, even for me, I sleep, breathe, live MMA. That's what I do in a lot of my spare time. I have a part-time job that doesn't include going to McDonald's and making minimum wage, thanks to you. I mean, and, it is a sport that I grew up watching because I still am only 17 years old, yet I've been doing this for over 4 years. And so, I mean, yeah, just like everybody else, I thank you because a lot of these past 4 years, for me, has revolved around the sport that, hey, if it wasn't for you, wouldn't be here. So, thank you for that.
You know what's interesting, Nick? Let me make a comment there, is that people have asked me, did I think that this was going to become big? Milius and I used to talk about it. When I say Milius, I'm referring, of course, to John Milius, screenwriter and film director, the guy that starred out of Schwarzenegger with Conan the Barbarian. Milius was our volunteer. We never paid him. I gave him a box of cigars once. He was our volunteer creative director. And John was a great student of the martial arts, of war, of sports, and fighting, and so forth. And a great gun aficionado, by the way, and a great cigar aficionado. He's the guy who taught me everything I know about cigars, quite frankly. But Milius used to say, when you think about it, you go around the world, it's soccer and some fighting sport that is really the most ubiquitous sport for young guys and now increasingly young women to be interested in. He was right about that. It's something that deeply connects wherever you go. Every country has some version of a martial art. You can't find a place on the planet that doesn't have its own version of hand-to-hand physicality, some sort of a combat, encounter. So this was inevitable, and I'm pleased that I was in the right time in the right place. I said to somebody a couple of days ago, I said, I had the right connection and the right complexion to pick the right direction. And so here I am, talking to you over an internet connection. So, I mean, this has been inevitable. And in a way, it's been so gratifying. It isn't work for me. This has all been fun. It was fun back in the day, and it's still fun for me. You can't be in a better place in life to be doing something that you really like to do. Doesn't get.
Do you feel like over these past 2 weeks, and particularly past 2 days since the public has known about your induction, that you've been part of the UFC family more than you have in years?
Yes. I said that yesterday to Dave Meltzer when he interviewed me, and I said it to the people at MMA Junkie. I said, more than ever, I really feel the way they've reached out to me recently and included me, really part of the family. I got a chance, like I said, to sit down and talk to a lot of young people, male and female, over at the UFC doing the job. There's 270 employees over in that building, and they're doing that job, every aspect of it. Digital graphic design, matchmaking, fitness, training, marketing, TV, public relations, you name it. And being there and seeing what is now being done to advance both the brand and the sport, and having me there and having people reach out to me the way they did. Everybody wanted to meet me. I was swarmed everywhere I went, and everybody wanted to take a picture with me and shake my hand. A lot of people had read the book. So, it's been part of the family, like you said. Doesn't get much better than that.
Sure. I'm curious, have you talked to Dana White since all of this happened?
I have not spoken to Dana recently. He's been very busy, of course, and recently I've been pretty busy. But I know we're going to get a chance as we're moving forward here to July 5th to hook up. And he was very gracious to me in the 20th anniversary. He was the guy that reached out to me personally and told me, he said, we're showing this over in the theater at Red Rock to all the employees. And he said, you're the star of that first hour. He said, you really do a job in communicating what it took back in the day to get this thing rocking and rolling. So I know Dana's got a great appreciation for not only the brand but the sport, and he's been very gracious to me.
When was the last time you did speak with him?
I bet it's been about a year now. Probably been about a year. Yeah.
Was that just catching up? Not to be the fly on the wall that wasn't there, but was that just catching up? Or was there something specific? It might have been a congratulatory call, and after this purchased, when I say it, the franchise got purchased by William Morris Endeavor and IMG. I think I'm sure that was right around that time. I think he's done a good job of being the face of the UFC. I think he's become as viable and visible as Vince McMahon is for WWE, and this is something that the sport needed, and I think that Dana has filled that role and done it pretty credibly. And speaking of the UFC purchase back in July of 2016, we spoke less than a week after that happened. I remember getting your thoughts on that when it was fresh, when it had just happened. We didn't know at the time when we last spoke what it would look like. Now that WME-IMG Endeavor has owned the UFC for nearly 2 years, I don't know how much you pay attention to the everyday product of the UFC, every event, but in your opinion, how have they done?
Well, that's a very interesting question and a very good question. I think that there's an inevitability to a company which was primarily entrepreneurial in its roots, becoming owned by a much larger organization. I think that there's an inevitability to looking at minimizing risk and strengthening the areas that are profitable and that represent growth for the future. And I think that was inevitable. That they actually, a lot of people left the company voluntarily or involuntarily when that purchase was made. And you're right, it's 2 years ago. So I think when I talked to Dana a year ago, it was probably about something else. I do remember talking to him, I guess, in 2016. But Nick, I think it's inevitable that that a company that was once very entrepreneurial, and I think it was quite entrepreneurial under Lorenzo Fertitta. And I think that it's inevitable that you're going to probably have a different orientation towards growing and strengthening the product as opposed to maybe breaking, now new ground. So I think that, you're going to get some people who say, well, the UFC ought to be doing this or that, and maybe they're not doing this or that. So for some fans. But I think that you have to look at the where a company is on the arc that they take to growth. And I think that, the UFC at this point obviously wants to continue to grow Fight Pass. and to add the number of people who will enjoy that product. I can see that they're broadening the Fight Pass content menu, and they want to look to not only backwards and forwards in that direction. Obviously, when I was there, I was looking up at the map and seeing where the emphasis is for the future. And certainly Latin America, which was called LATM on the map, the Latin American market, and looking at Asia. I think you could, if I were the UFC today, you got to say to yourself, gee, tomorrow's customer may be in places like India, China, and perhaps the Middle East. There's 360 million people in the Middle East, a lot of young males that could be, and they're getting involved more and more in MMA. So I mean, when you look at what the UFC is up against and what the challenges and opportunities are, the growth in areas other than Europe and North America is quite interesting and quite promising.
Well, in one geographical location that I don't think you mentioned that I think the UFC has some potential. It'll be tough to pull off, but I think Africa, I think they have the most African fighters in the UFC they've ever had, particularly South Africa. I know a fighter by the name of Don Madge. He is South African. He just got signed. I think that's a market that it'll be tough to do, but I think they could make it happen.
Well, I think if you're a fan or you're a journalist like yourself, when you look at the UFC and you try to analyze where the opportunities may be, it has to come down also to where the customers are, and do they have the disposable income to follow the product. And then you've also got to look at the fighters, and you got to say to yourself, if we want to penetrate China, how many of the great fighters have already been signed up by ONE FC? Because when you look at a market, you got to say to yourselves, we've got to be able to go into that market. We've got to either develop fighters from the ground, or we've got to access fighters that the public has some knowledge of in order to be able to develop that universe. The UFC today, I'm sure, has no problem selling tickets to a live event in the United Kingdom or in let's say, or anywhere in the United Kingdom, including Dublin, because of past successes that they've had and past successes with access to fighters. So to address the point you just brought up, I think you've got to say, where's the market in Africa, and it's growing and in importance and size, and will we have access to the fighters? Unlike maybe China, where both ONE
it's dominated by one, yeah.
And now you've got, as an example, you've got M1 going to China and doing shows in some big cities to compete with ONE FC. So if you're the UFC, you got to say to yourself, where are we going to get the fighters? And where's the market there? And if we can bring those two things together, we could sell a lot of tickets there. So the UFC, I think, has some great opportunities ahead. Obviously, this year, whether they're going to stay completely with Fox and renew there, or whether they're going to wind up with some other relationships, this is an important bellwether year, I think, for the UFC. And as they move off into year 26 and into the future, it's going to be interesting for not only us as the fans, but for journalists like yourself to be covering what the developments are that will have an impact.
No, 2018 for the UFC is a very important year, particularly because of that Fox deal that does come to an end at the very end of this year. This is all speculation, but do you have any ideas as to what will happen? What do you think? Your predictions? Not
really. I'm probably not a lot different than fans, and probably not as knowledgeable as a lot of journalists who have stayed close to this. I think that you have to remember, back in the day, 77% of our revenue stream, when it was a joint venture between WOW Promotions and Semaphore Entertainment Group, was due to pay-per-view. Now, that's still the number one revenue source for the UFC. Probably your licensing with television is number 2. Probably Fight Pass or live events is number 3 or 4. So more than ever, you got to say to yourself, if you're the UFC, if we move away for any reason from pay-per-view, we've got to increase the revenue coming in from number 2, which is television licensing. Now, of course, the great model in that universe, if you think about it, is the NFL. Look at the NFL today. They don't sell you the Super Bowl on pay-per-view, but it's the biggest single event other than Christmas and Hanukkah in terms of someone's holiday season. But in February, for the pay-per-view, when the Super Bowl appears, everybody's focused on the Super Bowl. I mean, the NFL has done a great job of splitting itself up with a couple of different networks in terms of coverage. And more than ever, if you think about it, Nick, the ability to be able to have access to the talent, which is ultimately what the UFC wants to do. That's what they did with the Tough reality show. And I was pitching a show at the same time. Lorenzo was pitching it back in the early part of the decade. We all knew that Vince McMahon's formula of having a weekly cable show to create your heroes and villains, your baby faces and heels, and then you move them over to pay-per-view is the magic formula. On the other hand, if you move beyond pay-per-view, having cable and network available to develop your product, to create more awareness for your athletes. Look, we know a lot about Tom Brady today, don't we? You know, Hall of Fame, eventual Hall of Fame quarterback, won how many Super Bowls? You know, we know a lot about Tom Brady. Everybody knows who he's married to, what he does, how he works out, how tall he is. We know all about him. And ultimately, if you move away from pay-per-view, by the way, that's the weakness of boxing. You go and ask fans in the street, who's the welterweight champion today of the sanctioning body, or who's the junior light? They don't know. Pay-per-view doesn't do a great job of selling you the stars of pay-per-view. Now, network and broadcast, cable and network, wow. If you can, so it'd be very interesting to see where the UFC will go in this next year. But as you pointed out, this could be a bellwether year, a pivotal year for them in terms of what they do. I have no doubt that with Ari Emanuel and Endeavor, you're looking at some people with vision, with experience, with knowledge about the big picture, and have the business talents and skills to take the UFC to the next level. Look, I give Zuffa full credit for taking what we had done back in the day and moving it to Spike, to Viacom, and later moving it to Fox. And now you can see that under the leadership of Endeavor, you're going to get them looking to make an incremental increase for the UFC to move it into the future, to maybe get involved more in the Indies and the Chinas of this world. I think that the future of MMA, the future of the brand and the sport is very good.
Do you, I was going to ask you if you think Endeavor has any regrets. By the fact that you just said the future is very bright, all that, I would assume you are going to say Endeavor doesn't. But the reason I do ask is because 2015, 2016 were great years for the UFC. 2017 wasn't a bad year. It was a bit of a slower year, though. And I think that's fair to say. You had one fight from Conor McGregor, and that was in boxing, so they don't take home all the money in that one. Whereas in 2015, 2016, you had the reign of Ronda Rousey. Conor McGregor becomes champion. They fought more than once both years. I mean, if you look at 2016, you had the McGregor-Diaz fights. I think that was the biggest pay-per-view ever, or right up there anyways. 2017, a bit slower. Do you think Endeavor expected this, and do you think they regret anything?
I doubt that they regret it. I think that they, as I said, are big picture thinkers. This is the sort of company that looks in 5 and 10 and 20-year intervals. So, you know, if you see a dip due to the fact that the UFC is a little weak now in terms of star power. By the way, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that back in the day, we sold the 3 letters. We sold the UFC. The UFC was the star. But by the time we started to develop the Mark Colemans and the Tito Ortiz and the Tank Abbotts of this world, then the era of the stars became an issue. Today, it's central. It's central more than ever. In fact, the strength of the UFC compared, let's say, to Bellator, and this is no criticism of Bellator, but they have not been the star-making machine that the UFC has been. And quite frankly, given the size and power of the UFC, sometimes if a star was developed at Bellator, it didn't take long for them to end up over at the UFC. So more than ever, the UFC will continue to look to make stars. Of course, I'm very proud being inducted this year that 8 out of the 14 fighters in the pioneer wing of the UFC Hall of Fame are fighters that I recruited, fighters that I was the matchmaker for. The Dan Severins, the Mark Colemans, the Tito Ortiz, the Sakurabas, the Don Frys, the Randy Coutures. Very proud of the fact that Maurice Smith, first striker to give a grappler, especially a ground and pound grappler, fits. I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to bring in the caliber of men that I did, because early on, that became the template for later on finding the Diazes and the McGregors and the Rouseys of this world. All that was happening there was they were finding the newest, more exciting versions of what we were developing back in the old days. So the name of the game more than ever is stars and development of stars. And again, the world is now the oyster. I mean, maybe the best light heavyweight in the world is some youngster from Harbin in China, you know, or some Cajun from Bogalusa, Louisiana. Who knows? The beauty of it is that it might be from some kid in Kazakhstan, Mongolia. Who knows? Fascinating.
I find it funny that we're having this conversation just hours before Fedor Emelianenko fights Frank Mir at a Bellator event. I mean, you spoke about Bellator briefly and talking about how they don't really build their stars, and it's kind of funny how the UFC almost spits out their fighters, and then Bellator, once they're a little past their prime, look at Fedor and Frank Mir, they'll take them up and try and build off that. But I just find that interesting that we're having this talk when arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time, well past his prime, is fighting
the last
at
emperor. The last emperor.
Yeah.
On the other hand, something a couple of years ago, I was doing the early book tour when the book came out in 2014, and I remember at one point, one journalist said to me, he said, "Art, I've made a study of this." He said there were 4 star makers in MMA. I said, "Really?" He said, "Who do you think they are?" He said, "I start with you." He said, "I would go to Sakuraba at Pride. Noriyuki Sakuraba at Pride." He said, "I would include Bjorn Rebney at Bellator." And he said, "I would add Dana White." I said, "What about Scott Coker?" He said, "No, I wouldn't include Coker in that list." So I find that was his opinion. So, the fact that when you look back in MMA history, maybe there have only been a handful of people who had the ability to be able to judge fighting talent and then charisma, personality. We are in the sports entertainment business. But Pride did a good job of putting people in a boxing ring and moving their careers in an interesting path to the point where the UFC eventually bought them and took those fighter contracts over and rolled it into what they were doing. Same thing with the WEC. But I think that the ability to develop stars is one that it can't be underestimated today. I'm sure the UFC, with all the employees that they have over there right now, is working very hard to find tomorrow's star. I'm excited about the fact that last November I did a speaking engagement out in Norfolk, Virginia at Langley Air Force Base in Fort Eustis. And I was there with Jens Pulver, Little Evil, and the California Kid, Uriah Faber. And I was there with James Vick, a new young lightweight out of the UFC, who just had a recent victory in their show in Austin. And I was impressed with him because he's 6'2", he's got a 78-inch reach, and he's in the 155-pound class. Now, when I was hooked up with him, we were on the speaking tour, and he was eating every dessert that he could lay his eyes on. Every time there was a pudding or cake or a pie, I turned around and James was eating it. I said, "Jim, what do you weigh?" Oh, he said,
"Let me guess. I bet he was 190 or so."
That's exactly right. Nick, you got it within a pound. He was weighing 191. I said, "James,
wow.
I said, you make it down to 155. And at 155, this guy is a handful. If you're a 155-pound fighter, fighting a guy this tall, this physical, with this reach would be a mind-blower. But, you look at guys like that, and you see that the UFC, that there's talent out there. The ability to take that talent and develop it is the future of the UFC. And I have no doubt that, believe me, when you look at the roster of film talent over there at Endeavor, you look at the actors and directors that work for it, that they represent, William Morris Endeavor represent, you have a great feeling then that they understand talent as well as anybody on the planet. That's their business.
No, yeah, they are a talent agency at the end of the day. So, I'm curious. You mentioned Pride, just real quick. What do you make of Horizon FF? Have you looked much into it? They're kind of trying to be the Pride 2.0 in a way. It's a really cool organization, but I mean, again, with them based out of Japan, their events are say on at 2 a.m. and 4 times a year. It's a really cool. I enjoy their events, but what would have you seen any of it?
Here's an interesting way of looking, and for fans, not just you as a journalist, but for fans to look at the MMA world, to think about it. In a sense, there's, at the top of the food chain, there's the international level. When you think about it, that's kind of like just the UFC at this point. When I say the international level, the ability to be able to do events in multiple markets, right? Then, way down at the bottom, you think about it, there's a bunch of local promoters. I don't care whether you're talking about Omaha or you're talking about a state, Rhode Island, or you're talking about a Canada, or you're talking about China. In a sense, ONE FC is a local promotion in China. Until they show up in Las Vegas or in Melbourne or in Stuttgart, they're a local event. So you've got this top of the food chain, the only company really in an international position, and then you've got a whole bunch of people on the local level. Quite frankly, what's missing is what's in the middle, right? They're all gone. So for Ryzen to want to think they're going to come in, where they're going to try to fit, you know where they're going to end up? They're going to end up a local promotion in Japan. That's what they're going to be. Unless they can figure a way to make deals, to negotiate relationships where they can wind up with their product outside of the Japanese market, they're going to be a, quote, local promotion. The world is full of them. I have friends of mine in every state in the United States who are doing local promotions. My good friend Jeff Meyer here in Las Vegas does Tough Enough. My good friend Ted Williams does Gladiator Challenge in California, Arizona, and New Mexico. So the world is full of promotions at this level. Here's the UFC on the international level. There ain't hardly anything in the middle. So for Ryzen to think that they're going to come somehow get in that middle, I'd like to see how they're going to be and what they're going to do. My conclusion is they'll probably just end up as a, quote, Japanese promotion. You can see it if you get up at 2 a.m. to watch what they're doing. That's the problem.
Although I will say the major difference between Ryzen and a Midwest local promotion in the U.S. is that they do have a broadcast. You can watch it, whereas there's a lot of promotions where, I mean, even Gladiator Challenge, they had an event last Saturday. I don't think I could have watched it if I had wanted to.
There's the advantage of Fight Pass in that you've got, promotions like Invicta or Victory that are local promotions. And by the way, I didn't mean to lump everybody at the bottom, but in a sense, if your promotion primarily sells tickets and has limited TV access, and you're right about the fact that your Gladiator Challenge, if you live in Kansas City, you're not going to be able to see Gladiator Challenge. But in all fairness, if you live in Kansas City, when are you going to be able to watch ONE FC? See?
Yeah, it's true. You can. It just you have to get up at not ideal time.
Ryzen is in that predicament. In a sense, they're not at the Gladiator Challenge level of being local,
sure,
but they're also not at the UFC level either.
No.
So again, there's this dichotomy of top and bottom, and there's not a lot in the middle. Now, to me, the really creativity that would be shown by promoters would be to figure out how to get a niche in the middle and be able to work it right and work it hard and make money for your investors and satisfy your fans. The other opportunity is for somebody to now challenge and wind up rising to the international level and being a truly international brand to rival the UFC. And admittedly today, that's going to take a lot of capital to do that. But then again, that's been the case now for a while. We started the UFC for $1 million back in the day. And as you pointed out 2 years ago, the Endeavor paid somewhere in the billions range.
$4 billion.
Yeah, yep. And that was the advertised price or the publicized price. But whatever they paid, it's a lot more than the kind of capital accumulation necessary to do what we did in the old days. So more than ever today, this is now a game that the ante to get in the game is considerable. But when you look around the world, there's a lot of capital, and now when you look around the world, there's a lot of potential fans. The internet today potentially unites a kid in Jakarta who's interested in MMA with a kid in Oslo, Norway, or that kid in Bogalusa, because they're all interested in the same thing. Who's the best? So whoever can figure out how to bring them the best and do it in a way that gets them interested, whether they're in Bogalusa or in Kazakhstan, is the key to the future. Because when you think about it, we're all curious to who is the real Lord of the Ring in these weight classes. In these for men and women. And more than ever, the job today is to be able to bring the fan what they want. Really, it's always going back to, what does the fan want? What does the fan want? What do we got to do to make the fan happy? And when you answer that question and you can figure a practical way to make that happen, now you've got power in your plans. Because a plan on the back of a cocktail napkin means nothing unless you can figure a way to make it a reality. And there are a lot of good local promoters who probably in the privacy of their own room at night think, I got a great show, but no one knows it. How do I make it bigger? Again, how do I get it off the deck, being, a guy who does a state or a city or a region or even a country? How do I get it up there?
Yeah.
That's
I think one promotion, ACB, Have you heard of ACB? They've done a good job of what exactly you're talking about. They started based in Russia, I believe, particularly maybe even Chechnya, but somewhere in Russia for sure. And they recently did a show in Brazil. They went to the States. They went to Canada very recently. I think they're going to Australia very soon. So I mean, they very quickly are becoming one of the bigger organizations.
That's very fascinating. You bring that up for the benefit of the fans listening to this broadcast, and that is that there probably are some people out there that are starting to make some moves in this direction. And now it's going to be interesting to keep your eye on them and see who's successful and who falls by the wayside. But from what I've heard that they're doing as well, it seems like they're starting to think outside the box, and they're starting to realize what we're talking about here. The ability to grow in the future is the ability to be able to address fans wherever they are and to provide product for them that they'll be loyal to you, whatever your company, whatever your brand is. That's the future.
And Bellator has done a good job of doing things the UFC isn't. They are going to Rome this summer. The UFC hasn't gone to Rome. They've gone to Israel twice. The UFC hasn't. And Bellator's done a good job in Europe.
Bellator, by the way, is right underneath, if you want to talk about a number 2 brand.
Yes.
The UFC is at the top of that food chain. You got to give up. On the other hand, and I don't believe every rumor I hear, I get the feeling that there might be some dissatisfaction with Viacom with Bellator. Bellator's most recent numbers were 242,000 viewers, and those are numbers considerably under what Bjorn Rebney had been able to do when he was the principal and the owner over at Bellator. And quite frankly, Spike converting over to Paramount, you can see they're going after more of a family audience, and you wonder if the, quote, Bellator product really fits from a programming content standpoint in terms of what Viacom is doing with what used to be Spike and is now, I guess they call it Paramount. So, I mean, that's an issue there. I wonder if somebody came along and offered to buy Bellator from Viacom, if there could be a sale there. Who knows? Conceivably, if you were going to buy Bellator, you'd have to ask yourself 2 questions. What would my TV access be if Bellator is sold? It probably wouldn't be on anything Viacom owns. Wants to sell it to you. And number 2, do all of those fighter contracts go with the sale? That's a crucial question whenever you buy a promotion. Do they have contracts under exclusive, fighters under exclusive contract? Do those contracts go with sale? So those would be some questions if anybody were thinking about, any of you fans out there thinking of buying Bellator, don't call me, but call Viacom and ask those questions. Could I be on anything that you have that have as a network? And what about those fighters? Are they all them boys under contract?
Bellator president Art Davie, 2020. Probably going to happen.
Get me in trouble, Nick.
Well, last thing before we do let you go, because I said, I think off air, maybe just before or after the interview started, that last time we spoke, we went on for 90 minutes, and I figured this would be a little shorter, but hey, we're coming up to an hour, but hey, I could go all day, and we don't have all day. So last thing for you, what is going on in the life of Art Davie? I know from now until July, you'll be very busy with doing interviews and everything related to the Hall of Fame. I'm sure you'll be recording, if you haven't already, things for Fight Pass, previews for the Hall of Fame, other things like that. But I know when we spoke back in July of 2016, you were talking about doing your movie. You were talking about other projects. What is going on right now in the life of Art Davie?
I've been working for the last year on this novel, Demigod. It's the story of the first superstar of MMA. And I've had to do research back into ancient Greece because Polydamas, mentioned in the book, Is This Legal?, was a giant who won in Pancration in 408 BC. And I'm writing a novel about his life. So I've been working on that for the last 10 months. And I'm very influenced by Herman Melville's Moby Dick, where you have a first-person narrator telling the story. And I started out writing this as from the third-person perspective. But now I'm writing it from the first-person perspective of somebody who knew Polydamas when he was fighting and knew him when he died. So that's been really cool. And, of course, in January of this year, we optioned the book, Is This Legal?, to a producer who brought on 2 fantastic writers who have got some really heavy credits in Hollywood. And the script was delivered to me yesterday. Me and Sean. And so I spent last night reading the script. I'm very excited about it. And the producer is represented by William Morris Endeavor. And the writers are represented by UTA. And they have turned this script over to their agents. And their agents are now preparing lists of actors and directors that will get the script. So we'll have to see what happens. But Is This Legal is an interesting story. It's a quest, a 4-year quest. My memoir about what it took to get a whole bunch of people following me, the Pied Piper, down this crazy road, which resulted in those 3 letters, UFC. So we'll see what happens. But that's what I'm working on. I'm going to be very busy between now and July with the Hall of Fame. Very excited about that. They're building a wonderful exhibit. It'll go out on tour. I'm helping them with that, with material that I had in my files, bringing them in touch with other people that have collected things from that era. And very excited about this new project for me, this novel. I think that my agent's very interested in it. Demigod, can you see that?
I can see it. Yes, it looks very cool. When do you have any timeline for that, as far as when it'll be ready to go?
Well, you know, the old story about how long does it take to write a novel, it takes as long as it takes, you know. I'm no for, Norman Mailer to write The Naked and the Dead. So Harper Lee to write, her famous book, which won an Academy Award for Gregory Peck, To Kill a Mockingbird. So, I mean, I think I'm going to have the book done by the end of the year, the novel. I'm excited about that. How long the movie? They're excited about moving it forward through the agents, through Graham Taylor over at William Morris, and through the writers' agents over at UTA. So we'll see what happens. I'm hoping that the film will be in front of the cameras early next year, and will be released maybe sometime before the end of 2019. So we'll see.
And one thing on the movie, I know we spoke about it a bit last time we talked, nearly 2 years ago. Were those producers and that company you were working with, did that fall apart, or is it the same thing, but just was it put on delay?
No, that's a good question. We auctioned the book in April of 2015, so you and I spoke about it at that time, that year, this year, 2016.
The year after, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I finally got the option back from them. They had written a good script, but they had some problems among the partners, and for various reasons, I was able to get the rights back. So then I was able to talk through my agent at Wasserman, Debbie Spander, who also represents Sean Wheelock, and we wound up getting 4 offers from different producers, including one from the original producer, Legacy Entertainment, under a new company named Monte Carlo Pictures. But we wound up getting offers from 3 others, and they were excellent. So I was able to make a final choice. So this is a new producing team, starting in January of 2018, and now the script is done. So we're real excited about that, and we think that this group has a real good chance, given their representation by Endeavor, to be able to move this forward. Because, Endeavor does own the UFC.
Yes. That is a very cool coincidence that you'll be making this movie and it's, connected to Endeavor. Art, thank you so much for taking the time. It's always a pleasure and honor to talk to you and pick the brain of the UFC creator. Again, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here talking to you, well, of course you or pretty much anybody else. And so thank you for that. Thank you for the time. I appreciate it. If anybody needs to find you on social media, and I know you have a lot of stuff to plug, you have a lot of stuff coming up, the floor is yours. Just plug away your Instagram or any social media you use, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is, and anything else.
Well, on Instagram, I'm UFC Creator. On Skype, I'm UFC Creator 1. You can always reach me through isthislegalthebook.com. Art D at isthislegalthebook.com. And I'm certainly available on Facebook. I've got 4,600 friends on Facebook, and I'm always active there. And also, again, Art Davie at Twitter. So just Art Davie. So anybody who wants to reach me, please feel free. I talk to fans. Everything I've ever learned about what I'm doing, the thing that got me into it was the fans. I was convinced I understood something about what they wanted to see, and that gave me the opportunity to write the plan that I did. But I'm looking forward to, certainly the growth of the book. We've now taken the rights of the book back temporarily in terms of we know that when a film comes out, they'll want to market the book then to some of the bigger publishers in New York. And my agent at Wasserman is very excited about that. They're very excited about Demigod. They can't wait to see that finalized, because they feel that might have some film possibilities, maybe starring a Dwayne Johnson. I don't know. It's Polydamas. Who knows? But I'm real excited about this Hall of Fame situation. As I said, for me to hear now from the fans and how important it is to them tells me that the UFC Hall of Fame is big because it comes from the UFC, period. So, Nick, it's always been a pleasure. We've done some great interviews in the past, and I'm looking forward not only to this one, but for you and I to maintain contact and for me to keep you in the loop as things move forward. And certainly, I hope you'll be there at the premiere of the movie.
Excellent, Art. Thank you again, and I may be going down to Vegas for International Fight Week. So if we cross paths, that'd be awesome.
You're there. I've got a ticket for you to the event on the 5th.
Well, I'm hoping on the 5th. That's the induction. Yes, I will be there. I'll be at all the stuff.
Okay.
Hoping to. Just yesterday, I think I applied for media credentials to the 2 UFC cards on the Friday and Saturday, and so. Yeah,
because I'll also be at the events, the top event on Friday, and I'll be at the heavyweight championship fight with Usyk and Cormier on Saturday. I'll be cage side. So if you don't have a press pass, let me know, because I'm sure you will. But I'll make sure I cover you. I look forward to seeing you that week.